Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to this webinar, which is about Irish women playwrights, with a focus on strategies for research, teaching, and professional practice. My name is Patrick Lonergan. I'm Professor of Drama and Theatre Studies at NUI Galway, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. This webinar happens as part of a project that we're doing on the Creative Arts Canon and the Creative Arts Curriculum. That project is funded by the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning at Third Level. Our interest, I think, is in how the canon informs the curriculum, but also how the curriculum informs the canon, the relationship between what we teach and what is later produced, but also the relationship between what is produced and what we eventually teach. We're interested in the ways in which that relationship between the canon and the curriculum reproduces discrimination or neglect or omission or other forms of bias or unconscious or otherwise. So we have four speakers today who are going to address this topic, and then we have an opportunity to open it out for a broader discussion with all of you as well. Before we begin, I just want to thank my colleague, Dr. Ciara Murphy, who's organized this webinar and indeed the series, and also our technical manager, Dr. Sihra Hoover. I will mention this is a part of a series that is running. The other webinars are available for consultation on our YouTube channel. And coming up next week, we have a really excellent webinar that is about some of the work that our students have been doing. So that's going to be led by Dr. Frances McCormick, and you'll get to hear from students in music and drama and English at NUI Galway. It's now time to begin hearing from our speakers. So I will introduce each of them before they begin to speak, and we're going to go through them alphabetically by surname. And so therefore, our first speaker is Dr. David Clare. David is a lecturer in drama and theatre studies at Mary Immaculate College in Limerick. He was previously the holder of 2 IRC-funded postdoctoral fellowships here at NUI Galway. His books include the monograph Bernard Shaw's Irish Outlook and, coming soon, Irish Anglican Literature and Drama. He's also edited collections on the Gate Theatre, and coming very soon is a 2-volume collection from Liverpool University Press called The Golden Thread, Irish Women Playwrights from 1716 to 2016. So, David, you're very welcome, and over to you.
Many thanks, Patrick. And I suppose I'll just begin by talking about the fact that I really do consider drawing attention to the work of unjustly neglected or unjustly marginalized Irish women playwrights to be kind of a key part of my mission as a theatre scholar. And I suppose that has very deep roots in the sense that ever since childhood, probably a majority of the writers who were most important to me and who resonated most with me were women. And I feel like that's probably always informed my work to a certain degree. And then also, I suppose, as an Irish theatre fan who's been attending Irish theatre since early 1995, I've always kind of been bewildered by the lack of work by Irish women that makes it to the stage. I would also get bewildered by the fact that even highly successful works by women would often sink without a trace, whereas hits by men would be revived over and over and over again. And I suppose the whole situation was kind of maddening because I kept hearing reports and reading reports of great successes that Irish women playwrights were having in London and New York and San Francisco and further afield, and was wondering why Irish theatres and theatre companies weren't bringing that work back to Ireland. I suppose then when Waking the Feminist happened, and I listened to all those kind of horror stories that Irish women theatre makers, including playwrights, were telling about the rejection they had faced at the hands of male gatekeepers in the main at Irish theatres and theatre companies, I really felt like I have to do something. I have to step up my efforts to promote plays by Irish women playwrights. And today I just want to talk about 3 areas of my work where I try to do this. First, my individual research. Second, my organizing of academic events. And third, my editing of books. And I want to show how this research-related work on Irish women playwrights informs my teaching and subsequently my theatre practice. So to start with my individual research, I suppose the way I usually work is if I'm interested in a topic, I kind of look into it and turn it into a conference paper. And that kind of gets my thinking straight on things. And it's great to get the feedback from colleagues, during conference panels, etc. And then I subsequently turn that work into either journal articles or book chapters or, feature them as chapters in monographs, etc. And so over the years, women playwrights I've spoken on, and in most cases subsequently published on, included Elizabeth Griffith, Mariah Edgeworth, Mary Balfour, Lady Gregory, Mary Manning, Christine Longford, Maura Laverty, Christina Reed, Mari Jones, Lizzie Nunnery. And I kind of keep digging into the work of different Irish women playwrights whose work kind of interests me. And I suppose what you see there, it's a combination of kind of well-known figures and then other people who have effectively been erased from Irish theatre history in many ways. And I found it very important to kind of find, recover works of theirs that maybe are hidden in archives or out of print volumes, and to kind of, shed light on them. Now, that research on all these women has subsequently informed my teaching in the sense that they've all been featured on my syllabi. And it's been great working with students, kind of digging deeper into these plays, many of which, have been, ignored, I suppose. And then in class, I've had students perform portions of these plays, and that's always been fascinating. Like, some of the works just are so powerful when they're up on their feet, as great as they are as texts. Those are really only blueprints for performance. And so it's been amazing to see this work brought to life. And in terms of theater practice, it's not just been a matter of like kind of getting students to perform these things in class, but also actually, doing full or even just workshop productions of some of these works. So for instance, last year I was co-producer of our first year production, and that was of Lady Gregory's The Rising of the Moon. And I also produced and directed a workshop production in which the actors were off book of several scenes from Lizzie Nunnery's To Have to Shoot Irishman as part of FemFest 2019 at Mary Immaculate College, where I teach. And that was a celebration of women in history and the arts. Second area of my work that I want to talk about today is my conference and conference panel organizing. In June 2016, when I was a postdoc at NUI Galway, I organized the Irish Protestant Playwrights Conference with Fergal Whelan. And in June 2017, after moving to Mary Immaculate College, I co-organized with Fiona McDonough, Aideen Wilde, and Justine Nikazi the Irish Women Playwrights and Theatre Makers Conference. And then in March 2018, I organized a panel for the ASEX conference, big conference in America on 18th century stuff, on Irish women playwrights from the long 18th century. And I suppose a key motivator behind these events was to seek out or highlight the work of scholars doing interesting work on a gamut of Irish women playwrights, all the way from Mary Davies, who was the first Irish-born woman to have a play produced in 1716, on through right up to today. And kind of seeing all those papers, gave hopefully everyone, but definitely me, a better sense of the richness of the work made by women over centuries. And at these conferences, we also featured public interviews, roundtables, and panels involving playwrights and makers who I feel deserved a lot more attention, including, for instance, playwrights like Ursula Rennie Sarma, Linda Radley, Celia Dufresne, directors like Sarah Jane Scaife and Maeve Stone, producer Julie Kelleher, and puppeteer Emma Fisher. And I suppose as a result of these events, works by women that I was previously unfamiliar with made it into my syllabi. It was great hearing about things I'd never even heard about before, and therefore being able to bring them into the classroom. And what was also great was to hear a lot of myths exploded by the different speakers who, a lot of times kind of these myths get lazily handed down from generation to generation. And so to have light shone on these kind of great women playwrights whose work hadn't been taken, I felt, seriously enough, to kind of come into the classroom and kind of be able to give the true story of maybe their past or the production history around their works was great. And certain papers featured at these conferences, panels, also firmly planted in my mind the idea to never neglect Irish language work or TYA work, Theatre for Young Audiences work. In terms of practice, we also use these events to produce works by women that I always wanted to see staged, or to revive productions that I felt deserved more attention. So for instance, at the Irish Women Playwrights and Theatre Makers Conference, we had the kind of stage premiere of The House by Anne Devlin, great Northern Irish playwright, and a production of The King of Spain's Daughter, which was kind of performed by MIC students, facilitated and directed by Waterford IT's Una Keeley, Kate McCarthy, and Dana Killian. And then at the Irish Protestant Playwrights Conference at NUIG, we had a revival of Justine Nikazi's great 2016 production of Lady Gregory's Grania. And then there were other productions as well, but those are all big highlights for me. The third area of my work I want to talk about is book editing. And Patrick's already mentioned the Golden Thread, Irish Women Playwrights 1716 to 2016, the 2-volume edited collection coming out with Liverpool University Press that I've co-edited with my colleagues, Dr. Fiona McDonough and Dr. Justine Nikazi. And these volumes really grew out of those events I already mentioned, whether that panel at ASEX in 2018 or the 2 conferences. And I suppose there was a lot of ground covered by the speakers at those academic events, but there were also gaps. And so I really kind of devoted myself to reading a lot of plays from the 18th through the early 21st century, many unpublished or in archives, to see what works might be valuable to highlight in those gaps. And a lot of really interesting plays were discovered in that way. And it was great to then hunt down scholars who maybe were working on those women. One highlight that sticks in my mind is Anna Maria Hall's Mabel's Curse from 1837, but I could list a bunch of others as well. The research that's included in those 2 volumes has really been very beneficial to me in the classroom, because I've subsequently gone on to discuss or feature on my syllabi a lot of the women that were featured in those volumes. Or I've taught certain classic works in a different way. For instance, Anna Pils's chapter on the production history of Gregory's The Rising of the Moon, really changes the way that I teach, how that day kind of came to everybody's notice. And similarly, Shirley Ann Godfrey, who's at NUIG, her chapter on Grania and productions of that in America has also informed how I teach that play. In terms of theater practice, I suppose from now on, I will always be looking for opportunities to produce some of the great and neglected plays that are covered in those volumes, such as The Double Disguise by Mariah Edgeworth or A Mother of Three by Clotilda Graves. And so I really look forward to kind of bringing those plays to life in that kind of way. So I suppose over the years, I hope that the attention I've tried to draw to work by women playwrights will strongly inform how my students regard Irish theatre history, and that it'll inform both their theatre making and their scholarship in the years to come. And the Mary I Drama program is we've only graduated 2 cohorts. It's quite young, so the jury's still a bit out, but all signs are good so far in terms of the work that the students are making and the scholarship they're engaging in after having left our care and keeping. And so, yeah, I suppose the acts of recovery that I've engaged with have been really, really enriching, and hopefully others find them enriching too. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, David. So great. Thank you. Lots of really great stuff covered there. I was particularly happy that you mentioned the excellent work that's being done in Waterford on Teresa Deavy as well, which we haven't included in this webinar, but which I hope anyone attending will be aware of. And if you're not aware of, well, we'll have to draw attention to it later, I hope. But really important work being done there. Anyway, now we're going to move to our next speaker, Dr. Shonagh Hill. Shonagh recently published her monograph, Women and Embodied Myth-Making in Irish Theatre, and that appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2019. Just as I was putting the notes together for this webinar, Cambridge wrote to say that they're bringing the book out in paperback next summer, just in a couple of months' time. And so I've got a link which I'm going to put in the chat for you right now, so you can pre-order the book in paperback. Shonagh has published articles and book chapters on Irish theatre and gender and performance in a range of internationally reviewed collections. And together with Lisa Fitzpatrick, she is currently co-editing an anthology of plays by women in Ireland from 1926 to 1933, and it'll be published by Methuen early next year. She's been awarded a Marie Curie Fellowship, which she is undertaking at Queen's University in Belfast over the next 2 years for a project that is entitled Generational Feminisms in Contemporary Northern Irish Performance. So Shonagh, you're very welcome, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Patrick. So I'm going to use my time to outline the approach that I take in my book, Women and Embodied Mythmaking in Irish Theatre, where I propose a genealogy as a way of forming a women's tradition. So this structure is intended as a reframing, an explicit intervention into existing structures which exclude women's voices and contributions, including the male-dominated literary canon of Irish theatre. Irish theatre history, as taught to me as an undergraduate in the late 90s, was a linear chronological narrative. It was almost exclusively male-authored and focused on the literary tradition. There were apparently just two women playwrights in Irish theatre, Lady Gregory and Marina Carr, and Melissa Sihra has written eloquently about this tokenism in her book, Pastures of the Unknown. One consequence of the continued repetition through scholarship and teaching practice of this linear model is that it has served to reinforce the apparent silences of stalled periods when women were excluded from the public sphere and supposedly absent from theatre, for example, the decades after independence. Linearity severs the connections which form a tradition of women's theatre. In my book, I deliberately adopt a non-linear approach, and I place plays from different historical periods alongside one another. Women's contributions to Irish theatre speak to one another across the decades through their embodied myth-making. And the performances considered include the Tableau Vivant, performed by the Daughters of Ireland, plays written by Alice Milligan, Maud Gonne, Lady Augusta Gregory, Eva Gore Booth, Mary Davenport O'Neill, Mary Elizabeth Burke Kennedy, Paula Meehan, Edna O'Brien, and Marina Carr, as well as plays translated, adapted, and performed by Olwen Fouéré. I propose the genealogy, which is a concept from the work of feminist philosopher Alison Stone. It's not concerned with origins, purity, and bloodlines. Rather, it advocates a coalitional politics, whereby women are connected together in complex and variable ways through historical chains of partially and multiply overlapping interpretations of femininity. The myth-making in the plays and performances discussed in my book comprise these chains of reinterpretation. Stone argues for a feminist genealogy wherein, quote, all cultural constructions of femininity reinterpret pre-existing constructions and thereby compose a history of overlapping chains of interpretation within which all women are situated. So for the purposes of my project, it was essential to address the different myths within their historical framework, as well as the experiences and histories which inform the women's own myth-making. This meant acknowledging difference. To give an example, the experiences of ascendancy class women at the turn of the century, like Augusta Gregory or Eva Gore Booth, differ in many ways from those of the contemporary writer, working class Dubliner Paula Meehan. The women are not united by essential characteristics, nor are the myths. Instead, we can address the ways in which their work intersects through their interrogative myth-making. Or as Stone describes it, all women are thus located within chains of reinterpretation that bring them into complex filiations with one another. The theatre makers discussed in my book are mobilised around an action, embodied myth-making, which draws attention to its socio-cultural situation. They explicitly engage in the process of breaking and creating links in the chains of reinterpretation of myths of femininity. I understand embodied myth-making as a process which reveals how bodies bear the consequences of myths of femininity, while refusing the female body as a passive bearer of inscription. The elision of female experience and of female bodies has been perpetuated by Irish theatre and the study of it as a predominantly literary theatre tradition. The examination of embodied myth-making is thus a vital intervention, as it enables the redress of Irish theatre studies' neglect of female bodies, both their creativity and their histories. And in connection to this point, I want to also highlight that the tradition that I bring together in my book is not authored solely by playwrights. The book opens with the Tableau Vivant, performed by the Daughters of Ireland in 1901, and closes with Olwen Fouéré's work. I say closes, but the structure of the book as a genealogy opens up the capacity to return to the tableaus through Fouéré's work. These performances are authored by women, but not by playwrights. So we might consider how the categories of the Irish theatre canon of the woman playwright supports a history which excludes women's contributions. So the challenge here is how and where we locate the traces of performance. Archives and anthologies are hugely important in terms of accessing material and having the means to teach neglected work. But we also need to consider what is it that's not so easily included. For the remaining minutes, I want to just talk briefly about the Marie Curie Fellowship, which I'm currently engaged in at Queen's in Belfast. One of the key components of the fellowship is the acquisition of new skills. So my project involves developing my practices research skills, both through my research and my teaching, under the guidance of Dr. Aoife McGrath. It's still very early days, but I'm conscious of how the fellowship has created the time and the space for me to explore different routes through research and teaching. So to close, I'm just going to share a recent experience. I'm currently working with Belfast dance company Maiden Voyage to develop workshops. These will be open to the public and they'll address two of my project research questions. One, an exploration of the embodied experiences of generations of women in Northern Ireland, and two, their relationship to feminism. This week, I shared the workshop that we've thus far developed with a group of final year undergrads who are undertaking a dance theatre module. So they had the opportunity to learn about the processes behind my research project, and they took part in the workshop, which meant that I also learned a lot from them. It was a valuable experience for them, but also for me, and not just in terms of progressing the research development. In terms of my teaching experience to date, this was a very exciting departure, namely the opportunity to do things differently, to try out more accommodating models which flesh out the gaps, which is exactly what I was concerned with in my book through the advocacy of the genealogy as an alternative model. It's a somewhat obvious point, but I think it's worth repeating in the context of the challenges to teaching in the last 12 months. And that is that we as teachers need the capacity and the support to explore and to be creative through our teaching practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shonagh. Great stuff. We're going to move straight on to José Lanters now. So José is professor of English and the co-director of the Center for Celtic Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. As I'm sure most of you will know, she has published widely on Irish drama and fiction, most recently on Mary Manning's Gate plays of the 1930s. She's also published on Marina Carr's Woman and Scarecrow, which is in the forthcoming Golden Thread volume, which is co-edited by David. And she has an article coming out soon in New Hibernia Review about Sean O'Casey's Nanny's Night Out and Anu's The Lost O'Casey. She's also publishing soon about Martin McDonagh's Very, Very, Very Dark Matter. Her books include The Theatre of Thomas Kilroy, which is published by Cork University Press in 2018, and co-edited with Joan Dean, Beyond Realism, Experimental and Unconventional Irish Drama Since the Revival. She's also a former president of the American Conference for Irish Studies. So I should also say José is joining us from a different time zone and thus had a much earlier start than the rest of us. So particularly grateful to her for making the time to join us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So I am going to talk about how my scholarship has informed my teaching and how my teaching in turn has sometimes inspired my research. So for the past couple of decades, Irish theatre has been, I would say, at the heart of my research, but until relatively recently, I wasn't writing about women. I worked on Tom Murphy, Brian Friel, Martin McDonagh, and in 2018, as Patrick mentioned, I published a book about the plays of Thomas Kilroy. And I do think that teaching a number of courses in recent years that focused on Irish women writers made me more interested in the women who are working in Irish theatre now and the women who were involved in it from the beginning. So a few years ago, I published an essay on the three plays Mary Manning wrote for the Gate Theatre in the early 1930s, Youth the Season, Storm over Wicklow, and Happy Family. I also wrote a book chapter on Marina Carr's 2006 play Woman and Scarecrow, which is coming out this summer in the book co-edited by David. And I'm currently working on two unpublished plays by Hazel Ellis that was staged at the Gate Theatre in the second half of the 1930s. I teach in the English department at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I'm fortunate that I've been able to design and teach courses on Irish literature on a regular basis. So a number of times in recent years, I have taught a seminar on Irish women writers, and that's what I'll focus on here. So it's a 15-week seminar, a semester-long seminar. It meets once a week for 2.5 hours and is aimed at senior undergraduates for whom it serves as a capstone course, and at master's students. And I last taught it in 2019. And the course covers the period from about 1900 to the present day. And the reading list includes short stories and poems, as well as a couple of novels. We also read the essays in Emily Pine's collection, Notes to Self, over a number of weeks alongside other texts. And students, by the way, responded to those essays in often extraordinarily personal ways, but that's a different story. So I'll concentrate here on the sections of the course when we talked about women playwrights. We began in the first week with some background reading, obviously, as well as, among other short texts, Lady Gregory's one act, The Jail Gate, which then also allowed us to discuss Gregory's role in founding and managing the Abbey Theatre. In the third week, we read Mary Manning's Youth's The Season, which was published in 1936 in Curtis Canfield's anthology called Plays of Changing Ireland. Students really love that play, which is, entertaining as well as depressing, and it deals with middle-class young people who have very few prospects. And it would be really great if that play were in print again in some more accessible form. So we read about the Gate Theatre and Edwards and MacLeamore, and I also gave them my essay on Manning, which had just come out, which explains some of the economic and social circumstances of the 1930s, as well as some of Manning's personal circumstances, including her somewhat tormented relationship with Samuel Beckett, which she worked into the fabric of the play. And it was also, I think, fun for me and enlightening for the students for me to share what it's like to work with the original play manuscripts in the archive, in this case, the Gate Theatre archive at Northwestern University, and to talk about the kind of things that you discover from working with those manuscripts, with those papers, about the evolution of the work. for example, that lines were crossed out at the rehearsal stage, probably because they were regarded as too provocative, and that, other quite substantial revisions took place between the 1931 Gate production and the 1932 revival. In week 5, we read Teresa Deavy's play Katie Roach from the Mint Theatre Anthology of Deavy's Plays, which at the time when I bought it, at least, came with a DVD of the Mint productions, which of course was very useful for our working class. The Abbey Theatre had also recently produced Katie Roach, so we were able to use the theatre's research pack for the play, which was available online, and also watch short excerpts from the production in the Abbey's promotional video. And since I'd seen the play in Dublin that summer, I could then elaborate on what was shown in the video and in relation to the script we read as well. Crisis pregnancies, the Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, and the general policing of women's bodies ran as a red thread, inevitably, through much of what we read in the class. In week 9, we read Mairead Ní Ghráda's 1964 play On Trial and Patricia Burke-Brogan's 1994 play Eclipsed, along with newspaper reports and other texts about the Kerry Babies case and the death of Anne Lovett in the 1980s, and Paula Meehan's poem The Statue of the Virgin at Granard Speaks. So all these texts deal with similar subjects at different time periods and from different angles. Ní Ghráda's play, of course, was originally written in Irish and then translated into English, published in 1964. But amazingly, my university library actually had the English translation tucked away in its remote storage facility, which was very lucky, because otherwise I think it would have been difficult to find the text. So again, it would be great if that play could be reprinted. So obviously there's a project here that someone should get their head around. In week 11, we read Marina Carr's By the Bog of Cats from 1998, which students always love. I teach it also in my undergraduate survey of Irish Lit. Back in 2008, I published a book about the representation of the travellers in Irish literature. So I'm interested in the fact that Carr makes Hester Swain in the play a tinker, which is her word, and to give students more context for that aspect of the play and to help them understand the challenges that travellers face on a daily basis. I was able to provide a variety of materials that I had collected over the years in connection with that research project. So it's always nice when one project feeds into something else. And then finally, in week 13, we looked at Louise Lowe and Anu, the theatre company she founded in 2009, and which became known for its immersive and site-specific productions. So because of the nature of Anu's work, you can't really teach the plays from a written script. And in any case, with one exception in Patrick Lonergan's Anthology of Contemporary Irish Plays, those scripts, are just not available. So we therefore read three texts about Anu's approach to theatre. And then in class, we watched video excerpts from their productions. And we were fortunate at the time that quite a lot of video material was actually available online. I was looking for some of it last night as I was preparing this talk, and I noticed that a lot of it has actually gone away, which is a real shame. So our main focus was on Laundry, which was performed in 2011, which brought audience members face to face with penitents inside the former Magdalen Laundry on Sean McDermott Street. So we watched the videos together, and then we discussed their context and their impact. And then we did the same with clips from World's End Lane and The Boys of Foley Street from 2010 and 2012, respectively, which were part of the so-called Monto cycle and were set in the old Dublin red light district around what is now called Foley Street. And these performances address the area's history of social deprivation and drugs and prostitution and so on over the course of the past century. So that also then tied back a little bit to what we started the course with in the first couple of weeks. So preparing this particular section of the course meant that I really had to immerse myself in the materials that were available about Anu's performances, which was a considerable amount of research. And this is an example of how, preparing to teach something then led me to a research project, because I really started paying attention to Anu's work. And my interest then was especially piqued by their 2018 promenade performance called The Lost O'Casey, which then prompted me to look more deeply into the relationship between this work and the 1924 one-act play by Shonagh Hill called Nanny's Night Out, which inspired it. And so I ended up writing an article on homelessness, addiction, and audience discomfort in O'Casey's Nanny's Night Out and Anu's The Lost O'Casey. And that will be published this summer in New Hibernia Review. So I know this is quite a lot of stuff that I crammed in here. So I'll leave it for now, and we can talk about any of this maybe in the Q&A, and I'll return the platform to our moderator, Patrick.
Great, thank you. So much appreciated there. Let's go straight to our final speaker then, so that we have plenty of time for the Q&A, because it's already apparent that we're going to have lots to talk about. So Melissa Sihra is our final speaker. She is the head of drama and associate professor in the School of Creative Arts at Trinity College Dublin, and she researches and teaches in the fields of gender, feminism, women in theatre and performance, Irish theatre and playwriting. She is the editor of Women in Irish Drama, A Century of Authorship and Representation, and she is the author of Marina Carr, Pastures of the Unknown, which we heard Shonagh mention a few moments ago. She's also the co-editor with Elaine Aston of a new Cambridge University Press Element series called Women Theatre Makers, and she is writing a monograph on the life and works of Lady Gregory. So Melissa, you're very welcome, and take it away. So we're now going to move towards the question and answer session, and I'll invite people to please prepare questions that you can pop into the chat, and we can put those to our four speakers. I'm going to invite the speakers to please turn their cameras back on, and while people are perhaps formulating their questions or comments for that matter, I wanted to really go back to the question of how we know what to teach, how we gather the information. So it's been very interesting to hear about the different experiences that each of the speakers have had in terms of things like editing collections, preparing anthologies, preparing syllabuses. And I was reminded when we were talking about that of when, Melissa, your book, your edited collection was being prepared. And if I remember rightly, you put out a call to kind of everyone to say, please tell us plays by women that we don't know about so we can include them in the book. So in a way, rather than making choices about, we're going to include these and leave out those, you just included everything. Could you just tell people about that maybe and how that process unfurled?
Sure, that was a really joyous labor of love, I must say, because it came from my intuition. As a postgraduate student, and like Shonagh, as an undergrad, I was never taught any female playwrights. There was no woman playwright apart from Lady Gregory, but she wasn't really thought about as a playwright. She was thought about as a nurturer of male genius. So I began to write about Marina Carr, and I just thought, I'm writing in a vacuum here. I intuitively knew, like I was kind of haunted, I suppose, because women are haunted in theatre history, haunted by our absences, haunted on the stage, haunted by demons of oppression too. So I knew there was a huge body of work, Patrick, and I just didn't know where it was. And I said, I'm just going to start digging. And I thought, there can't be just Anne Devlin, Lady Gregory, and Marina Carr. That's just ridiculous. And then, there are no Irish playwrights that brilliant festivals that we had in the early 90s, I just knew that women are half the human race. If, there's all genders included in that. It's just not possible that women are not expressing themselves. So I decided to just send a call out to everyone I knew. Tell me every single play, everything. Don't worry too much about your sources, because at this stage, I just wanted to. This isn't about creating a canon, as I've just blasted. It's about acknowledging a body of work. It's about acknowledging traditions and peoples who were there all the time, and I knew it. And my God, people just started giving those names, those plays. I started finding a lot myself in the most obscure places. So what I found was I compiled a list of over 650 plays by Irish women. And that, to me, was a major act of resistance and writing back to the violent oppression of canonicity and what I had grown up with, which was that women didn't write plays. And I knew it was a violent annihilation of myself as an Irish woman, and I didn't accept it. So this was a joyous liberation for me. And there's 250 women playwrights. And that book itself was a real joy to do. It was an act of trying to find myself in Irish theatre history, really, which is what all criticism ultimately is about, yourself, I think. That's why you write about a certain topic as opposed to something else. And then David's 2 volumes with Justine and Fiona are the natural progression of the work that began in women in Irish drama, and the brilliant opening up and acknowledgement of all of these voices, and the joy, as David said today, of finding, an obscure moment of a woman we've never heard of, and what was she writing, and where and when. That gives me great joy.
Yeah, I mean, David, you had a similar approach with your conference and the books that came out of it, which was essentially, there's so much stuff here, we need 2 volumes. So let's include as much as we can. Can you talk a bit about that, about the process that led to that?
Yeah, well, I suppose it was remarkable just to see the breadth of the work. I mean, we were in many ways working off of Melissa's list in some ways, in the sense that that kind of gave us a great sense of all the work that's been made since the early 1700s. And you can go back further if you include Catherine Phillips, an Anglo-Welsh writer who had 2 hit plays at Smock Alley in the 1660s. But I mean, I suppose there's going to be, for a good while, I think, a sense of filling in those gaps and getting a deeper picture of those names and bringing that work to life, both within scholarship, within the classroom, and then even on stages. And I suppose that when you actually expose the students to this work, it's just amazing to watch how it resonates with them. And, sort of like Melissa was saying, like people seeing themselves in these works from the 1700s or whatever, and feeling great sympathy with someone like Elizabeth Griffith, or, later on, I've had great success teaching Maura Laverty in more recent times. And, to just watch the students be so moved and to watch those scenes get performed. And for me to kind of have to, as the teacher, keep my wits about me, because I'm actually so moved at the top of the class, about what I'm seeing, with this deeply unjustly neglected work being brought to life.
Yeah. I can see plenty of questions coming through in the chat now, and I'll start to moderate some of these in a minute. But I did want to bring similar questions to both Shonagh and José before we move on. And Shonagh, I mentioned in your biographical notes that you're preparing an anthology with Lisa of plays from 1926 to 33, if I remember rightly. I don't know if you're able to say what's in the anthology yet, but could you maybe talk a little bit even about the choice of period, which is really interesting?
Yeah, so the plays that are going to be included, José will be delighted to hear Manning's in there, Youth's the Season. So the earliest play is 1926, Kate O'Brien's Distinguished Villa. There's Manning, Davy, 1-act play, A Disciple, Dorothy McArdle's Witch's Brew, Mary Devonport O'Neill's Bluebeard, which I became quite obsessed by after writing my monograph. And that's 5, isn't it? Margaret O'Leary's The Woman. So most of those plays are only available manuscript form in archives. Some of them have been printed but are kind of long out of print, and you could only access those texts even in the archive. So it's very exciting to be able to bring those, to make them available. And both Lisa and I, we talked about how exciting it'll be to be able to teach those plays. Because of course we've both for years have been spreading the word about them. I think it'll be very interesting to look at those plays as well in the context of the centenary coming up next year, with the establishment of the Irish Free State, because those plays fall within that time frame. So that was part of the decision behind choosing the plays, but also because there were this kind of cluster of plays that emerged at that time, which is no coincidence.
Yeah, I mean, when I see 1926 as a date in Irish theatre history, I instantly just go, well, that's, Play on the Stars, Sean O'Casey. But I'm also reminded of the fact that when I was an undergraduate studying Irish theatre, basically people stopped at 1926, and then they took the story up again in 1964 with Philadelphia, Here I Come. And so there was this kind of sense that nothing interesting happened between the Play on the Stars and Philadelphia, and thereby you're kind of forget about Teresa Deevy, forget about Una Troy, Dorothy McArdle, Mary Manning, and everybody else. So even just our choice of dates sometimes can kind of reinforce some of these issues. But José, to put the same question to you, but also to kind of maybe channel it through one of the questions that came in the chat about the difference in students' attitudes to female playwrights at different stages in one's career. I was thinking when you were talking about Mary Manning, I might be wrong about this, but I think your first book was about stage adaptations of James Joyce, was it?
It was, yeah. Well, I was going back a bit now, Patrick.
Yeah, well, but so Mary Manning, when she, like, her first play, obviously that people talk about is Youth's the Season, but she also got stuck into James Joyce and stage adaptations of Joyce as well. And I do wonder just about authorship, because Shonagh was talking about Alwyn Fuere as well, as somebody who has also done a stage adaptation of Finnegan's Wake in the form of River Run. Is there something there about the fact that adaptation is not seen as a version of authorship that merits appropriate attention? Or to maybe ask that question slightly differently, if you're writing about Mary Manning now as compared to maybe when you might have thought about writing about her when you wrote that book, would you go about it differently?
Oh, I would definitely go about it differently, yes. And that book, I mean, insofar as I knew what I was doing, I very much came at it from the Joyce perspective rather than from the playwright's perspective, right? And so what are they doing with Joyce rather than what is motivating, these playwrights from their own perspective. So definitely, were I to take on a project like that now, it would be a completely different book. And yeah, Manning is interesting because she has these two parts to her career, right? I mean, there's the early Gate career where she does some acting, and then she ends up writing the two plays and the one act, and then she goes off to America and gets married, and then in the 50s reemerges, right, and starts up a whole new chapter in her playwriting and play producing career, and I think that also deserves more attention now that you mention it, right? Why that was and how that was and how she remade herself in that particular way. But yeah, and the other thing I would say, I mean, I'm delighted to hear, Shonagh, that this anthology is in the works, because that really is, you can have all sorts of ideas about, from your scholarship about what you would love to teach. And then you find out that, this is completely impractical because none of these texts are available in any, accessible form, unless you get lucky and you find, an old copy somewhere that you can, photocopy or put on, some learning platform where the students can access it. But it's a challenge, and I think that's something that we have to bear in mind, that we have to make it possible, to teach these women. We could write, articles and monographs about them, but that doesn't help us in the classroom if we don't have the text for the students to read. So so definitely more teaching material, more anthologies, more accessible editions is I think a real necessity.
Yeah, I mean, there are, we have the anthology recently enough published by Syracuse and edited by Eileen Carney and Charlotte Hedrick of plays by Irish women, but so many other ones still out of print, including Mary Manning, as we've mentioned. But I wanted to channel this into one of the questions in the chat from Ellen, who says, what would it take to create a digital archive so it is accessible to all scholars, theatre researchers and actors? And I guess this is the point. I mean, we all know this, that a number of these plays, because they've been out of print for a very long time, in some cases, they circulate as kind of badly scanned PDFs if you're lucky. David, you have a bit of experience of arranging digital archives. Do you want to take that one? You're on mute. Yeah, I forgot my you're on mute sign actually yet.
That's all right. Yeah, no, I mean, what I found is actually there's a load of plays, if you know what you're looking for in places like Google Books or other kind of, repositories around the place, digital ones. And so, I think that there's a lot more work to be done in terms of, I suppose, highlighting that these texts are actually out there, already scanned or already transcribed. And these are ones that I'd be using in class, like when I'm teaching Mary Balfour's Kathleen O'Neill from 1814, like the actual version of the text published in Belfast by Archbold and Dugan in 1814, that is the copy in the British Library, is the one I'm actually using with the students. And it's really funny because it doesn't give an author's name on the title page, presumably because they think that nobody wants to read a play by a woman. So someone has handwritten in by Mrs. Balfour of Belfast. So it's great to even just draw attention to, that side of things. But there's actually a lot out there that, if we could kind of get some sort of, I know that I have the Classic Irish Plays database going, but I never get enough time to just keep adding stuff to it. But it'd be great to actually, to get some sort of database together that could link to all this and then some, and just keep adding to it.
Yeah, I think that's it. So, I mean, there are issues for consideration there around things like copyright that just sometimes even finding out who to ask about reproduction can be an exceedingly difficult thing to do because the records don't exist or they're not in good shape. But there is work being done. I should also mention that Cathy Leaney and Deirdre McFeely are editing a collection of plays by Maura Laverty, and that'll be coming out from Liverpool, hopefully sometime in the next year, I believe. But, plenty more to be done. I want to take two questions maybe together. The first from Shirley Ann Godfrey, who asks, can our scholarship influence theatre programming, or is educating future programmers the best we can hope for? And then added to that, Aisling has asked, she says, I would be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on the role of the Irish Arts Council and their funding models on the culture towards female playwrights. Do they have a responsibility to change the current culture or dictate to theatres and festivals to fill in the gaps? So what we're interested in there, I suppose, is the extent to which, we as scholars have a role to play in advocating, first of all, for what gets programmed, but also perhaps what gets funded. Thoughts, Melissa?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. Everything that I do, I would hope in some way can permeate the culture of curation and programming in some way. It's all a big conversation. That's all it is. So I don't even see a kind of difference between scholarship students, third level, and the practical world, because they're also interlinked. I mean, if you look at our island, there's so many drama departments now. There's so many amazing degrees in theatre and performance, and that's just amazing. 30 years ago, the one I work in was the only one. So if you look at how small our island is, it's all one big, huge conversation, and we all know each other. So everything I think we do, or everything I try to do and say, I would hope in some way does permeate the world of professional theatre.
I think we've lost Melissa there.
Oh,
yeah. Are you okay?
Hello, I'm back again, am I?
Back, yeah. We just
Yes.
did the last part of that sentence. We missed
Sorry,
it.
I've no idea what I said, so I'll just move on. But just that I think it's one big conversation, and everything we do, everywhere we go and talk to each other, it's all about deconstructing, getting the message out there, demythologizing, pulling down the old vanguard, which was in the 80s, it was all single white male authored, male directed plays with a male protagonist. I'm being general, but this is the truth of it. Apart, we had Charabanc, yes, but this was how theatre was made. So every thought and conversation I have about theatre is I would hope, part about that larger thing. All of my students, I look back, I've been teaching at Trinity now for 14, 15 years. We have 100 students per year. That's a lot of students. So they've all done my modules in women in theatre and gender and performance. We're always having these discussions. So they often come back to me and say how much our conversations have permeated their practice. And I also say to them how much their thoughts have permeated my research and my practice. So it's reciprocal. I think it's all connected. That's the way I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that kind of answers the question that Brenda Donoghue asked about the inclusion of plays by women on the courses and how that inclusion affects the students studying them. But I'd like to maybe put that question to José and the other speakers as well. But José, you also have a question about what you might do differently with that seminar that you taught now. So yeah, the question is about how students are affected by the inclusion of these plays.
You know, I mean, we have in my seminar. I think I had the last time I taught it, I had about 15 students. 2 of them were men. So students, you know, in the English department are, I think, to a large part female. Or maybe it was also the topic of the course that attracted these women, but the women are in the majority. And I think that, you know, they responded in really personal ways to what they were reading. They could relate to so much of what these plays were presenting. And so the conversation in the class is very different from what it usually is in other classes, where people are really sharing personal stuff, and they trusted each other enough to do that. And so the conversations became, you know, they were about the plays and the work, but they were also about how that resonated with their own lives and experiences, sometimes in very deeply personal ways. And it you know, the 2019 seminar, I'll never forget it, because it was such a collective experience for all of us, and it was so moving in lots of ways. And I think that would not have been the case had the subject matter been anything other than what it was. So I definitely would not change anything there. But of course, every time you teach a course, you know, you're faced with the new practicalities of what is still in print, what is new. And so if new things are being added that you really want to teach, then maybe something else will have to go. I think in future, you know, this was a course on Irish women writers, so it included fiction and poetry and plays. I think, you know, with apologies to the poets, but I might not do the poetry because students found it so hard, and it's also hard to come up with, you know, a good context within which to read some poems. Poems are often, you know, harder to access, and so you know, that raises all sorts of challenges. And in the kind of course where you're talking about, you know, kind of lived experience and a more kind of maybe a sociological context, maybe that doesn't work so well. So I might put maybe just focus on fiction and drama, or maybe, you know, if I can get away with it, completely talk about, you know, women playwrights and not have the fiction at all, since, you know, the Edna O'Briens get a lot of exposure in other contexts. So if they let me, then that maybe, and if there are new anthologies around, then maybe that's where I would go next with it.
Very interesting. I guess same question to you, David, but maybe taking up a question in the chat there about impact on male students. Have you detected any any particular influence on male students in particular, or is it too,
Yeah, no. I think what's interesting about this is, Melissa was talking about, the male-dominated nature of the canon. And one of the aspects of that is ideas around dramaturgy, and that there's very specific ways to structure a play. And what I find is that women playwrights are often kind of much more willing to experiment and do really interesting things in terms of playing games with time and space. And so I think what's been great about, making sure the syllabi are, kind of 50-50 split male-female, is that everyone's getting exposure to plays that really play games with form. And it kind of changes their mind around how plays can be constructed. And in some cases, you see the men kind of resisting because, not to disparage my own gender, but if we have kind of maybe a linear kind of way of processing these things, that sometimes when, Christina Reid and Belle the Belfast City, or, any number of plays I could call to mind where there's, kind of time jumps and different things like that, some of the male students will resist that, but others will be like, oh no, that's interesting. I didn't realize that you could do that. It sometimes reminds me of, I remember Prince once saying in an interview, people are always telling me to get into Led Zeppelin or these kind of things, but I don't have anything to learn from them. The people I have something to learn from are Kate Bush and Joan Armatrading and Joni Mitchell. And I was realizing, yeah, actually the way that the women approach form would be very interesting and different for him. And it's a thing that it's going to expand him even to, kind of come under that tutelage. So I do think that the males in my class have actually grown as playwrights and expanded their minds when it comes to dramaturgy just through being exposed to those works by women.
I think there's something there as well about men teaching these plays. Ciara Murphy and I have had conversations about this in terms of when we've shared out who's teaching what in a course. One year Ciara taught Carol Churchill, and then the next year I taught Carol Churchill, and just the fact that there was a different person at the top of the room teaching those plays had an impact on how the students received the work. And this in turn leads me to kind of put that question to Shonagh, and especially that focus on the embodied work that we see with NUI Productions, like the ultimate you had to be there kind of play. And similarly, Olwen Fourier, as I mentioned already, I mean, so much of her authorship is embodied, is corporeal, and therefore very difficult to capture with text. So thinking of the research that you discussed, how can we bring that kind of research into the classroom in a way that will allow students to engage with those works?
Yeah, I've written about NUI and on the Boys of Foley Street, and I had the same experience that you did, José, when I went to then teach it in the class and discovered a year or two later that the material I'd used online in a class, when I returned to it, it had all disappeared. But I think that scholarship has a really important role to play in that respect, because in my article on the Boys of Foley Street, I traced my journey through that performance. There's only 4 audience members at each performance, and you each go a different route through it. So a text or a script isn't going to do justice to that. So I was quite conscious of making that available. And then it was something that was, I don't know how conscious of it I was when I was writing my monograph, but when I spoke to Olwen Fourier after it was published, and she thanked me for writing about the work, and she talked about how it's really important for the work to be made available. So the process of scholarship actually functioning as an archive, so that you don't always have to have a script to teach in the classroom, that you've got other resources, and resources that bring in different aspects, like the more kind of experiential aspects, perhaps.
Yeah, it is one of those issues about digital material, though, that, as people have mentioned, the NUI production stuff was there and then it wasn't there. And similarly, we're all familiar with the experience of, I guess, the kind of digital graveyards where somebody establishes a database, but then, 10 years later, the material isn't there anymore. At least with a book, it's still on the shelf and you can kind of make a scan of it or a photocopy. or something else. So in terms of how we plan for a lot of these productions, like there is an issue about just the longevity of it, and making sure people will have sustained and sustainable access to the material. That's where perhaps something like the Irish Playography is so important in making scripts available for people to purchase. Brenda O'Connell has a question. Do the panelists think there is still a lot of unconscious bias towards women playwrights' work? And she's thinking of the Katie Roach revival in 2017, where she noticed a lot of empty seats for a play that should have been booked out. And just for those who perhaps don't know, this was staged at the Abbey Theatre, and it was a very, very good production. I think it's fair to say, very well reviewed, but didn't get much of an audience, and became a bit of a flashpoint in some of the debates about the Abbey and its approach to programming. Because, I mean, as I watched it as an audience member, I found myself thinking that the fact that the theatre had given it such a short run almost came across as a vote of, I don't want to say no confidence, but maybe limited confidence, and that might have had an impact, stopping the possibility of word of mouth developing and so on. So in other words, I guess the point I'm making with that Katie Roach is that a kind of a box ticking approach to, counting numbers of plays produced on a stage isn't sufficient, and there needs to be a more nuanced approach to the programming. Does anybody want to comment on the Katie Roach or unconscious bias in particular?
Well, one thing I would like to point out is that when the Abbey goes to do Teresa Deevy, they always do Katie Roach. So that was a great production. I greatly enjoyed it, but the lack of willingness to kind of spread out further. I mean, maybe this is the native New Yorker talking, but the fact that the Mint Theatre would be putting on Wife to James Whelan and all these other Deevy plays, but that in Dublin, the only thing you're going to see between the mid-1970s and 2017 is a lot of Katie Roach, if you get any Deevy at all, is dispiriting, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, there is that pattern there. I've written about this a bit myself, where like 1975, there's a controversy about a lack of plays by women at the Abbey Theatre, so they put on Katie Roach. 1994, there's a controversy about a lack of plays by women at the Abbey, so they put on Katie Roach. 2015, the rest, you can sing along if you want to. They put on Katie Roach in 2017.
I mean, and just to speak to that again, not to be Abbey bashing, but when it came time they're going to put on some Emma Donoghue. And when you think about the great plays that Emma Donoghue has written since the early 1990s, some of which Shonagh has written about, and they say, no, we're going to go with an adaptation of Room, because we haven't seen that enough, in some form or other.
Yeah.
So.
Did you want to come in there, Melissa?
Yeah, just about unconscious bias. I think, yes, there is unconscious bias towards women who are playwrights. And I would say that there's unconscious bias towards women in absolutely every aspect of life. So it's still there. I see it. I experience it. It's prevalent and present in every aspect of life. We see it constantly in our society.
Yeah, I think that's very very true. Brenda makes a point about Katie Roach that I think reinforces this, where she suggests, she says that it was programmed in a traditionally quiet slot, which begs the question why it was put on at that slot at all. So again, there's that question of, what was the conscious or unconscious thinking behind maybe not giving that play a shot. Aisling says, am I right in saying Katie Roach was also on during the Fringe, when you might be less likely to go to the Abbey? So yeah, I mean, I think, to be fair as well, we don't, as David said, want to Abbey bash, because I think, the programming of the play was great to see it. It was good that they gave it such a good production, and we don't want to be too negative about it. And it's one example of a much broader pattern. Quillen says that she's delighted to hear about Shonagh's new volume on plays between 26 and 33, a really volatile but neglected moment in the history of the Free State. And she absolutely agrees, only Katie Roach. So again, there's that thing there about the periods in which certain plays are produced, and why we neglect some plays over others. And it's particularly when we think about, the formulation of an Irish constitution in the 1930s that placed women firmly in the domestic sphere, and then think about that in the context of the plays that were being written at that time. There's a huge amount of work to be done there. Okay, now I'm jumping around an awful lot with the questions, so I want to go back up to Barry Houlihan's question. Barry asks the panelists the challenges that you may have had in recovering these works and in recovering the lives of the writers themselves. Historically, women's lives may be less documented, and has this meant that the writers suffer an absence as well as their plays? And he also adds, thanks to all, amazing papers all around. José, we might start with you on that one.
Oh, yeah, yes. I think, certainly when I was working on Mary Manning, I found that a little bit, that it's very bitty. And actually, the best information about Mary Manning often came from her two daughters, the two poets, and their sort of writing about their own lives, in which they then sort of coincidentally sort of referenced their mother and their mother's history and so on. And so when I was writing about Manning, a lot of the information had to be gathered from sources that you wouldn't perhaps immediately think about. And so I'm finding that a little bit now. I'm working on Hazel Ellis, who is even more unknown, and who started out as an actor in the Gate in the 30s, and then again kind of graduated to writing two plays for the Gate before she too, like Mary Manning, got married, and that was the end of that. And so that plays into what you just said, Patrick, about the Constitution and the, how women were sort of framed within the sort of marriage mother kind of context, and women really sort of saw very little else for themselves. But so the Mint, I think it was the Mint, did Women Without Men by Hazel Ellis, and so there was some research about her that was done, which is really kind of fundamental stuff, and so I'm really grateful for that sort of spade work that has already been done, because I know that it's very, very difficult to find that kind of information unless you have access to a family member of the person, or some kind of archive that is lurking somewhere where perhaps nobody knows about it. So again, I'm just beginning this project, so I'm curious to see what I'm going to run into, and what sort of challenges there will be ahead. But I think Barry is definitely right that that's apart from accessing the work, accessing the lives of the women and answering questions about them is definitely a challenge.
I'm going to mention the Hazel Ellis play by Mint that you mentioned a moment ago is streaming for free from Mint Theatre at the moment. So I've just popped a link into the chat there so that people might be able to access that. I'm not sure if the link is to the recording of the production, but you should be able to track it down from there. But I wanted to put the same question to Shonagh, but also just picking up on a comment in the chat about the difficulty of accessing materials related to Christina Reid and Anne Devlin. And I mean, I'm certainly not aware of any recordings of original productions of Christina Reid's plays. Possibly Anne Devlin might be in the RSC archive in Stratford, but really maybe that question more specifically about your own research, Shonagh, about the lack of archival material or reconstructing the lives.
Yeah, and certainly in relation to the anthology, Margaret O'Leary jumps out as an example of someone that there's very little information about her life. However, we have the play script, so yeah. And then in terms of writing my book and accessing archival material, one of the plays that was very challenging to find material about was Mary Davenport O'Neill's Bluebeard. The material was there, but it took an awful lot of digging and a lot of piecing together from other people's kind of lives and scholarship about them. Like once I learned about the involvement of Ninette de Valois, another very neglected woman in Irish dance and performance, but her role as well. But I think I'm very interested in that as well, how you can bring those lives together and how we can start you can build up the biography of one person's life by examining this whole kind of network of relations between women in theatre.
That's a great way of thinking about it. And I wanted to put the same question to Melissa, but it struck me, Melissa, given that you're writing about Lady Gregory, that rather than having a problem of not enough information, you might instead have the problem of so much almost inaccurate information. A century's worth of people like Yeats, who, of course, during the Nobel Prize acceptance described her as, what was it, infirm and broken down by age or something like that, which she wasn't. And so maybe specifically in relation to Gregory, I know you're working on this now. How has all of that kind of overabundance of inaccurate or distorting information about Gregory affected what you've been able to write and how you might go about?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it is such a huge body of information. So I'm only starting. What I do is I'm just reading absolutely everything, and you have to cross-reference all the time. Her own diaries are absolutely amazing because there's so many volumes of them. So it's interesting to get her perspective and her lens on things as well. But it is about piecing together, but it's about also for me looking at what's not said. So much is said, and so much is said again and again and again about her status and her marriage and her role of, working as a manager in the Abbey and all of this, and a founder. But looking always, what's interesting me is what's not said, what is left out, what I need to dig out of those narratives. And what is not, what I'm really interested in digging into is unearthing a way of accessing her artistic vision. So biography, you can pretty much work out what's true pretty quickly. I mean, there's so much written, but it is finite. So eventually you can get the facts. There's a lot of family members still alive. There are so many amazing historians working on Gregory. There's so many great people around the cool park. And I'm involved with all of them very much. So there are ways of accessing that. For me, it's about what on earth is the story that isn't told here. And that's her as an artist. That's what I'm interested in. So that comes through really trying to inhabit a sense of her vision of the world through all of her writings, through walking the places she walked, looking at what she looked at visually. That's how I very much access what I do, because I try to inhabit the work in a way, if you like. It's visually, I suppose, or through the landscape, So for me, it's about I want to find out the story that isn't told, rather than working out what's true. It's pretty obvious to work out what's true and what isn't, and then we always have the great Barry Houlihan to help us. So good.
Indeed.
Can I just kind of add a little anecdote to that if we have time? So, working on Mary Manning again, kind of cross-referencing, and there was some inconsistency about her birth year. Was it whatever it was, 1905 or 1906 or whatever. So I thought I'll go to the online Irish census for 1911 and see if I can find the family, and then I can establish what age she was and so on and so forth. So I was just trying to verify her age, and then when I finally got to the census, you get the original census form. I have it printed out here. And it was actually filled out by her mother because her father worked in the British colonial service in Africa and was absent. So Susan Manning filled out the census form. With the usual stuff, there's a number of questions that you have to answer, like occupation. And it says in the instructions, if you're just engaged in domestic duties, don't put anything. So she wrote mother, right? So and then the census taker wrote refused in the box. In other words, she refused to obey the instructions. And then, under religious profession, she wrote militant suffragette. So Manning's mother wrote militant suffragette, and then under disabilities, she wrote deemed ineligible to vote. So this is how kind of serendipitous information can, how it's kind of completely by accident, as a fluke, you find out all sorts of stuff about the family background that you would otherwise perhaps never be able to find. So that's just how research can throw up very, very useful and interesting facts.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess in the context where over recent weeks in Ireland, we've seen, you know, how important records are, how the falsification of records has cut people off from their sense of who they are, and the importance of all of that too. It really is a vital topic, isn't it?
I just want to jump in and say,
Yeah.
with regard to my work on Mary Balfour, she's obviously writing in the early 1800s, and so a lot of that stuff's lost to history. And I was very frustrated because the few people who had written about her, there was 3 different birth dates. There was all this contradictory information about her parents. So I ended up hiring a professional genealogist, Nicola Morris from Timeline Research, who's great and who you will have seen on Who Do You Think You Are and things like that. And she actually uncovered a wealth of, kind of materials from that time, from a whole bunch of different sources, from newspapers on through to, kind of Church of Ireland records, to piece that together. So Barry's right that there's a job of work to be done with loads of these women that will require pretty serious digging.
Okay, well, as was mentioned a moment ago, we are past time. In fact, we're over time. So I have one final question that I'm going to put to each of our speakers, and I'll give them a moment to think about it as well. The question I'll be asking is, what should we be teaching that we're not teaching? Okay, you can have one thing, and that could be a play, a playwright, or, as Melissa spoke about, a method such as exploding the canon. And while you're doing that, while you're having a little think for yourselves there, all of you, I will just pop into the chat there a link to Waterford's work on Teresa Deevy that I mentioned earlier. They recently had sharing a scholarship on Teresa Deevy event, which I think is really important for people to check out. So, David, what's your vote?
God, I wouldn't know where to begin. I suppose I would have to say that I would have, being half Iraqi, half Irish, I'd have to say something about playwrights from migrant backgrounds, etc. So I'd be thinking of people. I mean, obviously, I already teach Ursula Rennie Sarma, and hopefully others do as well. But even a Palestinian Irish playwright like Hannah Khalil. So folks like that, I think I'd like to see more of on curriculum.
Very good, Shonagh.
I think I'll go for expanding categories in terms of more discussion between feminism, queer studies, the category of women, binaries.
Yeah, so the intersectionality that we've talked about a little bit in some of the previous weeks is definitely coming through as a major theme. José?
Well, something that that I said in my presentation is the one thing I found that getting away a little bit more from the purely academic approach and getting students to talk more, to kind of find more kind of connections between students' lived experience and what they're reading. And I think that really kind of came out in this particular material. But I think in general, as an approach, I'm finding that students are much more responsive when they're actually allowed to talk about themselves to a certain degree in relation to the course material, rather than if you're really sort of trying to keep it at, but what does it say in the text? So I think that's definitely something that I've learned in recent years, and that I think we should be doing more of.
I think Patrick might have frozen there.
I think we've lost our moderator, yes.
Yeah, Melissa, maybe you might like to respond to the question.
Thanks, Sihra. Well, what are we not teaching that we should? I think it's very important that we don't only think about the primary sources, but the secondary sources, critical sources, and that we include women's voices as critics, as scholars, and as secondary sources. So many curricula I see do not have a balance of that, and that's really important. So we should be teaching more writers of colour. So I agree with David, more women of colour. Ideally, we should be teaching people of work by non-binary genders and trans people of colour and trans people and trans women of colour. And these works are not always easy to find, certainly in Irish theatre, but that's what we should be working hard to represent in our curriculum.
very much. And it's just a shame that Patrick has fallen out of signal there right at the last moment, but I'm sure he'd want me to say a big thank you to all of our speakers for a really engaging panel, and want to say thank you so much to all of the attendees and their wonderful questions. So that's it for this Friday afternoon. As Patrick said at the start, we have a really interesting seminar next week featuring students of the NUI Galway Creative Arts and English schools. So hopefully you'll stay tuned for that. But for now, we'll say goodbye. Thanks, everyone.